Hello, and welcome to our second collections care webinar, Collections 102, presented by the Ohio History Service Corps, specifically Amanda Wachowiak. Wachowiak, I'll get it, I promise. And the Ohio who's the member at Shawnee State University this year, and in partnership with the Ohio Local History Alliance. And I am going to go ahead and give it to Amanda at this point. I will note for everyone right before I do that that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available. We'll be sending out the link to you afterward to everyone who registered. So if you're registered and you're not here, welcome.
Alrighty, welcome everyone. Real quick before we get started, in your controls tab down at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little button with two little people heads that says participants. If you could go in there and tell me using the buttons, the yes or no button, who is here for the Collections 101 webinar? Okay. So I think most of you have been here. Alrighty, I just wanted to know because I did have a little bit of recap to go over. So we'll go a little bit quicker through that just to, so we don't spend too much time on it. Betsy, I will need you to allow me to share my screen, please.
You should be all set now. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we are now going to go over preserving and using your collections and what all that entails. This will be a little bit about policy, tiding over from last week, or not sorry, last week, on Tuesday. So quick recap, on Tuesday we talked about basically collections management policy, the types of things that you include in your policy to document your collections and make sure you know where everything is, when it is, and what it means to the public and what it means to your institutions. So we talked about deed of gift, we talked about accessioning and acquisition, we talked about how to catalog and do inventory, and we talked about labeling collections. So today we're going to work on understanding the differences between preservation and conservation. There is a very big difference between the two of them. We're also going to learn some basic steps that institutions like yourselves can take to preserve collections. And we're going to explore some ways to connect your community to the collections, because the reason we have them is for the community. And so the important terms are the same as the ones from Tuesday, just how an object or an item or an artifact can all refer to a physical thing within the institution, and that a collection is an accumulation of artifacts. They can be associated by a group, or they can be just part of the institution's whole collection of things that they have. And that an archive is non-current records that are of permanent value. And then we have the idea of stewardship, which is, sound and responsible management of everything entrusted to the institution. Policy, which is our guidelines and how we interact and our responsibilities to the people. And that an institution is just the group that you are a part of, museum, archive, historical society, whatever it may be, that works to preserve and interpret and make available the artifacts and documents that you all keep safe. So we're going to hop right into the differences between preservation and conservation. Preservation is sometimes called preventative conservation. I don't really like that term because then it confuses me with, conservation, preventative conservation. It gets confusing. And I still trip up sometimes calling one thing the other thing. So preservation is reducing and preventing hazards to the collections. You are regulating the environment and controlling exposure to hazards that may threaten the collections and limit your ability to grant access to the collections, whatever access looks like for you. Conservation involves usually a conservator who is a trained professional in an entirely different field. For example, I have a master's degree in public history, and that does not cover conservation. I received training in preservation. What can I do to prevent the need for conservation? But I did not, conservation is an entirely different degree, and it's very specialized. And it uses specialized equipment and training, and there's usually some sort of laboratory. It's all very fancy. And the treatment of the objects, a lot of times it can permanently alter the artifact. So like if you think of conservation of a painting, you're scraping off, like a layer of resin and reapplying and touching up paint. Like, it is reversible because of the types of materials used, but you are permanently changing that item. And then just real quick, historic preservation is a whole nother category that has to do with preservation of buildings, structures, landscapes, and just larger, physically larger items of historical or cultural significance. So that's another category entirely as well. So when it comes to assessing preservation needs, different materials all have different preservation needs. What you would do to preserve a textile is going to be different from what you would do to preserve a plastic item in your collection. Condition reports, which we talked about in Collections 101, which is the process of examining an object and noting down anything basically that's wrong with it. Is it broken? Is it deteriorating? So when you do a condition report, you can identify, the items that are fragile or perhaps deteriorating more quickly. And so condition reports really help prioritize what items might need more stringent preservation work. It helps you take preventive measures. That's basically what preservation is. You're taking preemptive measures to make sure that your collections are as stable as possible. And things that really help with that are routine inspections of the building. A lot of places, a lot of institutions will do daily walkthroughs. Every day they'll walk through all of their exhibits, all of their collection spaces, staff areas, visitor areas, and just doing a walkthrough, like you'll learn quickly what is out of place, what is different about the space. You can even tell like, oh, is it hotter in here than normal? And it just gives you, like, it lets you put your finger on the pulse of what's going on at your institution. Another part of preservation is knowing when it's time to contact a conservator. That's a really difficult question to answer. Most institutions are not lucky enough to have a conservator on staff. It's a very sort of specialized field, and it can be expensive to hire the help of a conservator. So consider how valuable, not just in terms of monetary value, but like intrinsic value, like, what is the meaning behind this item? Is it in danger of, collapse basically? And should we consider hiring somebody to help us, make sure that this item continues to stay around? So with preservation, it's always good to start with the basics. I included this picture of a toilet on a historic ship because it's, large items are particularly hard to preserve, and visitors do not always know, in this case, what is and is not an artifact. This toilet is in fact an artifact, and the sign is attempting to convey that. But aside from that, environmental regulation is like the very bare basic of preservation. So that includes light, humidity, temperature, pest management, and object handling. So I'll start with light damage. One of the things I say most often in my daily life is light damage is cumulative. I know this because I'm a very pale human being. If I stand out in the sun too long, I will burn. There is no tan, there is only burn. And, we see what, too much sun exposure can do to the human body. Imagine what it's doing to an inanimate object. Light damage is irreversible. Intense light for a short period of time can be as damaging as low light for a long period of time. I hope I said that right. Intense light for a short period is almost as damaging as low light for a long period. Yeah, I said that right. Light damage can take the form of fading and discoloration. Have you ever seen like a really old document that's been sitting out for a long period of time? It tends to look like really dark around the edges and crusty. It kind of looks like, you left it in a fire for a hot second. We measure light in lux for these purposes, and 50 lux is generally considered like safest. It's a very low light level, but it still mostly allows viewing of artifacts. Other things to consider to help control light are window coverings, indirect light sources. So this image here is Toledo Museum of Art, I believe. And they have protective coverings over their skylight. They also have little pilot lights that they can direct away or towards artifacts as needed. Directional lighting can be incredibly helpful because, your exhibit space isn't always the same. So if you have a way to like turn light away from particularly fragile items, that's always a good idea. There are devices that you can purchase to measure light levels in your collections areas. Unfortunately, I can't remember what the price range is on that, but I know you can purchase them online for, I'm sure you can look on Amazon and find something, cost effective. Another thing to keep in mind is if you can eliminate light entirely in your collection storage spaces, so like areas where your collections are not on exhibit, wherever you keep the items that are, out of rotation, just eliminate light entirely. Like if you're not in there working with them, just turn the lights off. Don't let any light in there. And that'll help improve the longevity of items. Climate control is a doozy. We all know how expensive it can be to keep the AC blasting in this hot summer weather. When it comes to temperature and humidity, I think they're pretty intertwined. One can definitely affect the other. When we look at temperature, around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit is where you want to keep your temperature. That being said, that's not always possible. And so in lieu of that, people usually say keep it stable. You don't want huge temperature fluctuations, even from season to season, because that's going to cause rapid expansion and contraction of materials, which will cause damage. Like, you see like your wooden deck out in your backyard during the winter and in summer, like over the years, the wood starts to break down. So, that's a real life comparison, I suppose. You can, if you have temperature monitoring devices, just like your HVAC or just like a little thermometer that you keep in your exhibit or storage areas, record that temperature. And you can see where it's at over time, which can help you gauge if your overall temperature is stable enough. They do make digital recording devices, but that gets really expensive. So it's something to really consider, do you need it or not? And then humidity, it's usually good to keep it around the same area, 65 to 75. Oh, I put degrees Fahrenheit, that isn't right. 65 to 75 RH. Why does that say the same thing? That's very strange. Well, I found something that I overlooked. But yeah, humidity is also good to keep stable. And it can also cause problems with artifacts like sweating. Like you see the beads of moisture on like a cold can of Coke on a hot day. It also can facilitate the growth of mold. So you don't want like a really humid environment. And also you can buy technology to monitor humidity. And like I said, humidity is measured in RH, so relative humidity. And then we have pest management. I do not like spiders or centipedes, which is where that image came from. Artifacts are very tasty to pests, anything from insects to arachnids to rats to mice. If it's an organic material, they're probably going to want to try and eat it. It's pretty simple to look for signs of pests. You can look for droppings, you can look for nests, you can look for spider webs, dead insects. You might even see damage to artifacts in some cases. And also monitoring them can be pretty simple as well. You just get like a simple sticky trap for insects, and you can set them out in areas of your exhibit space or your storage space where you have seen insect activity. And you leave it there for like a set period of time, like a month, 2 months, and then you can look at the trap and see what is there. A lot of times the presence of one type of insect or arachnid can indicate the presence of other pests. So, and I'm not an insect expert, you know, I'm not up on the entomology, but it can be pretty easy to look up what types of critters are present in your collection, and then act accordingly to eliminate them. Just be mindful that it's usually not a good idea to spray pesticides in your collections areas. So just be mindful of that when you go about treating or bringing people in to treat for you. And another way to eliminate pests is just don't have food products in your collections or exhibit areas. An infestation could be as simple as somebody left a bag of chips in their office drawer over the weekend. You know, it can happen that easily. And of course, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of institutions are worried about their collections, you know, because nobody's in the offices, and what if something was left behind, and just, you know, the general inactivity sort of is a trigger for pests to go into the space and be like, what can I get my tiny little teeth on? So object handling, I don't really usually see it included in preservation, but I did so anyways because careless handling can cause preservation problems. It's also dangerous for the handlers of the objects. Like if you're trying to move something heavy, for example, in this image, that is myself and several co-workers or fellow volunteers who were handling this large art piece. It is a mosaic made of glass. It was very heavy. And if one of us, if there had only been 2 of us and we were trying to move it, we probably would have gotten hurt, or the mosaic would have gotten damaged. So it is very important to have safety first for both you and for the object. You can see in that image, we're all wearing those bright green, lovely gloves. I actually love that color of glove. Gloves are a big debate. There's usually the gloves versus no gloves versus cotton gloves debate. And there's a lot of theory on like, you know, what is, you know, best. I definitely prefer nitrile gloves over anything. Like if I'm gonna be handling, you know, an artifact, I put on a pair of gloves for the most part because I do not always know what that object is made out of. You know, suppose, you know, instead of a glass mosaic, I was handling a piece of taxidermy from the early 1900s. You know, that piece of taxidermy could have arsenic in it, and I would be, you know, I could become seriously ill if that, you know, came in contact through my hands, through my skin, you know, if I had a cut on my hands. So like, if you don't know precisely what something is, I would consider gloves because it puts a barrier between you and the object. Cotton gloves are, I guess you could consider them an eco-friendly alternative because, you know, they are reusable. You can wash them and use them multiple times. The only problem is, you know, they have a texture to them, and they can snag on things. And so you got to be very careful about like when you use them. Also, if you got a heavy item or a smooth item, you know, that thing could, you know, slip out of your hands. They're most often used, I think, in archival settings, particularly for guests, so that you can better protect the manuscripts and whatnot. And then there are, of course, some situations where no gloves is preferable. We probably could have gone gloveless in this case with the mosaic, because gloves do inhibit your tactile ability and your grip somewhat. But we were pretty confident that we were able to handle this easily with the gloves on. So that's something to consider when you're moving objects. One other thing, like one of my sayings that I have in the museum world is that handles are not handles. So if you have an antique teapot, you do not pick it up by the handle, you pick it up by the widest part, because you don't know how fragile that handle is and it could break off entirely. By that same token, smaller or fragile items might be better off moved in their box or their housing, you know, because just touching it to move it could cause damage. So if you have it in the box and you move it that way, it provides a little bit more stability. And then circling back to the large objects, it's always good to communicate with whoever's helping you beforehand and plan your route. It sounds sort of really simple and obvious, but you know, when we were moving that mosaic, we talked extensively beforehand. Okay, who's going to stand where? Who's walking backwards? Where are we taking this? And where are we setting it down? And we moved very slowly. So it's just one of those things where it's like, you know, take your time and also examine your object before you move. Because if it looks like, you know, it's going to fall apart at the slightest touch, or if it's, you know, even in multiple parts, like let's say you're moving like a puzzle, for example, you know, you wouldn't just like pick that up and move it. So it's important to know what the object is and what its components or parts are before you move it, because you might drop something that you didn't know was attached. So now we get into what I've been hinting at, which is dangers within the collection. The objects themselves may present a danger to others, including people and other collections items. Off-gassing is something that we hear about a lot. There are a lot of materials like plastics and woods that have varnishes and things on them can off-gas, which is, it's just like gaseous air and things that are sort of like building up in the atmosphere as it deteriorates. There could be toxic chemicals. You think about wet specimens in natural history collections. Those containers are sometimes filled with formaldehyde, which can be incredibly dangerous to people in particular if you're in an enclosed space with a whole bunch of formaldehyde. And like I talked about before, there's arsenic in vintage taxidermy. So it's, you know, it can be difficult to see at first glance, you know, if you have any of these dangers in your collection. And so it's very important to like be aware that this is, you know, a possibility and to take proper safety precautions. Another thing that I don't have on here is vintage weapons and vintage ammunition. The older gunpowder gets, the more unstable it becomes. And generally that's not something you want in your collection space at all. Another thing to consider is that, you know, if there are residues or something like red rot or verdigris on one of your items. Red rot is a condition that happens to some leather materials, and it just causes like this reddish, nasty looking discoloration. And verdigris is like a green discoloration on some types of metal. Stuff like this can transfer to other items if they're touching. So if you see something in your collection where you're like, oh, that item is infected, you know, this can spread to other objects in the collection, it's best to isolate it and don't let it touch anything else. And if you happen to touch that item, make sure you change out your gloves, wash your hands before you handle anything else. So I've been talking about housing. This is an image pulled from Gaylord Archival. They have great stuff that you can purchase in bulk. All their stuff is, you know, acid-free archival materials. They have a wide variety of sizes of boxes and things of that nature, but they are rather expensive. So it's plan strategically. But generally when we talk about housing, acid-free blue cardboard, and any sort of acid-free, you know, stable plastics and papers are, you know, best for long-term storage. Ethafoam is a good padding material. It's very sort of dense, and you can cut shapes out. So if you have like an oddly shaped, you know, delicate ornament, you can make a cutout for it in ethafoam and, you know, place it in there so that it's, you know, cushioned and stable. There's mylar plastic, which you can use to isolate documents. Say you have one that's really delicate, you can put it in between mylar sheeting and give it some more stability. You can separate objects from each other that are related and you want to keep them in the same storage space, but you don't want them to touch. So you can get like trays with little cubby holes in them and keep things separated from each other but close by. One thing with acid-free storage and cardboards and papers and things, it does not stay acid-free forever. It will start to acidify, is that the right word? It'll start to become acidic over time. And so you can buy these pens. It's like a little marker, and depending on the acidity of the item you are testing, like the box or the folder or whatever, you put a mark in like a corner, and then the ink will turn colors based on whether it's acidic or basic or somewhere in between. And they usually come with like a color chart to tell you, you know, what's going on. Not so great if you're colorblind, but I'm sure there's somebody you work with who would be able to tell you, you know, what it's saying. And then I have down here open versus closed storage when it comes to like shelving and like, you know, mass storage for your collections. There's pros and cons to keeping everything on open shelves versus in, you know, like a cabinet. You know, keeping things in a cabinet helps isolate from pests and from light and dust even, because dust can be a problem to artifacts. It is abrasive and it can scratch delicate things. But open storage, you can see everything, you know, and, you know, suppose there was, you know, a disastrous, you know, flood or something like that. If everything's in closed storage, you may not see the amount of damage right away. So there's pros and cons to both. And I think the biggest takeaway from this is, you know, what is available to you and how can you make it work? You know, because I've seen collections who like literally go buy shelving from like Walmart or something like that, and it works out great for them. So now we transition over into using your collections. I use the term using because
Actually, Amanda, it may make sense to pause briefly here and do a couple of questions if you're willing to.
Oh, yes, of course. I was ready to just like steamroll through. Okay.
Because we do have a couple of collections care and handling questions that make sense.
Of course, yeah.
To hang on here. So, so Miranda had asked back with temperature monitoring. Is there a safe fluctuation range, such as like 3 degrees plus or minus?
I think what I was seeing, if I remember correctly, it's like plus or minus like 5 to 10 degrees. I would probably say closer to 5 degrees. Like little fluctuations like that are going to happen. Like you would have to have millions of dollars in order to keep a stable temperature all the time. Yes. So yeah, a little fluctuation is okay, but you don't want to be like 60 degrees one day and then 90 degrees the next day. That's not, you know, that's not a good idea.
Yeah. And then, so we have so another question, and this may involve a little research, but any suggestions for early aircraft instruments that are slightly radioactive from the radium used to illuminate the gauges? As long as the glass is not cracked, are they stable and okay? So when I was in school, I did get the chance to work with an adjunct whose full-time job was at the Air Force Museum there in Dayton. Is it the Air Force Museum? Yes.
Yeah, so they are very lucky because they have a very large facility to keep all their things. But when it came to radioactive materials, they had a whole separate caged off area where it's like, here's where the radioactive things are. Don't go in here unless you're told to. And the way they kept things safe was, they measured the radiation levels and stuff like that and figured out what they were. And for most of them, it was just safe enough to keep it in a drawer. Just isolate it, like put that one layer between it and everyone else, and it was fine. So I think it's one of those things where you may have to do a little bit of extra work, like maybe see if you can pull in an expert, and just make sure, like, I think it's one of those things that I would try to isolate from everything else because of the nature of radiation. I'm not a radiation expert, but I do know it's something that you should probably keep isolated.
All right, and that's what we had for collections care.
Okay.
So I just wanted to get those in while we.
Alrighty. Oh, did we have another one pop up?
So Heather had thanked you for that answer.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't mess around when it comes to radiation. It's a scary thing. So as I was saying before, I think using your collections, I can refer to a variety of different objectives, and generally it means, like, how are you going to get the public to interact with the collections and with the history or the science or whatever it is you're presenting, because collections can be used for a variety of purposes, including entertainment, education, even research opportunities. And they present an opportunity to collaborate with other people outside of your institution. So interpretation is a major part of having your collections. An old newspaper is an old newspaper until you realize it's documenting an incredibly important part of history, either because it's a unique newspaper or because, it's documenting a period of time and the things that were happening in that area. I'm using newspapers because this is Shawnee State University, and these students and Drew Feit, who is my supervisor, are interacting with the newspaper collection there. But you want people to interact with the collections in a meaningful way. You can plan activities, provide them relevant information. You want them to make a connection and get something out of the collections. You can even use collections to address community and public needs, whatever's happening in the world at that time, or even at a local level. You can relate to people by saying, look, we've seen this before, or, here's another period in time where people were dealing with this exact same thing. And it sort of brings a human connection to these otherwise inanimate objects. So yeah, collections kind of don't mean a whole lot unless people get something out of it. Tours and exhibits are probably like the major, most common way people interact with artifacts. Exhibits present and interpret objects to visitors using text and graphics and just presenting information in writing about these items, or via speech if you're giving a tour. Exhibitions are another option. They're a more short-term and non-permanent exhibit. So, let's say, this example that I have in this image here is a 30th anniversary exhibit for a museum. A 30th anniversary is only for a year, so this exhibit lasted about a year. They had it up for about a year. There's also special events that you can do. If there's like a historical date and your institution has objects, relating to what happened during that time period, you can do special events for that sort of thing. And I have tactile exhibits up here because I noticed that people just want to touch things. Like if there's not a piece of glass between, them and the object, they want to touch it. And that's not always safe, and it's not at all desirable because, touching, shortens the lifespan of this item. And so if you have, hundreds of people, or even, just a few people every day touching this item consistently, you run the risk of, irreversible damage. And so if you have objects that you can make into like learning exhibits, and say, okay, these things, we have doubles of this or whatever, we can sacrifice it so that people can touch and interact and learn in a different way what this thing is and how it was used. That's always an option. And I think it's an important thing to consider because, like children and people with learning difficulties and disabilities, tactile exhibits can be really helpful to them. The only problem is, with the pandemic, you have to make consideration for that. And, how is there a way that you can do it safely? And I think institutions are still working on that idea. Speaking of the pandemic, there are a lot of online opportunities. It can be very sort of strenuous and require a lot of time to, take full advantage of these. I see a lot of institutions doing social media posts, be it Instagram, Facebook, or some other type of social media, where they feature an object or they talk about a certain period of time and relate it to an item in the collection. I've seen like, curators pick of the week or, like a throwback Thursday or something like that, holiday, specials and things like that, and stuff around social movements. So, posting about, an item and saying, here's how this relates to what's going on today, that can be a way for people to interact remotely. I see a lot of virtual archives. This collection that I'm showing right here is from the Wright Brothers collection at Wright State University, Special Collections and Archives. They have a very robust online archival collection. So like you can do research, right from the comfort of your own home, with a variety of collections that they have at their disposal. So, but it, like I said, it does take a lot of time and energy to, scan and catalog. And like, if you're already familiar with cataloging, it may take less time, but like the type of information you provide is different than like your technical data catalog for your institution to keep track of everything. There's also virtual exhibits. I think they're becoming more common now, and there's a variety of ways to do that. You can take still images and just, like create sort of, I guess it'd be like a PowerPoint slide type of deal where you go through items. I've also seen this really cool thing where people take like a 360 camera and they walk through like an exhibit space, or like I saw one on YouTube where it was, I guess it was a Google employee going through Pompeii with a 360 camera, and you can just turn in any direction and see Pompeii from your living room. It's really cool. So there's a whole bunch of new technology making virtual exhibits possible. And again, it's about how much time and money you're willing to sink into that. Aside from providing access to collections during a time when our access to people and interaction is limited, providing virtual representations of these items can protect unstable artifacts. Like if you have this sort of historically and culturally significant artifact and people want to see it and interact with it all the time, like it's your most requested item, but it's really fragile, you can take high-res photos of it and provide that to people instead. I suppose creating a replica would also be an option here as well, but again, time and money. But yeah, these are all like things that we've been thinking about more often due to the pandemic. So I put this in here really quickly because researchers are cool. Like they're awesome because they're interested in the history, they're interested in the information you have to provide them, and they're looking to learn something to add to their own knowledge. And maybe they're writing a thesis paper or they're writing a book, and you have the power to present that to them. However, you still have your duty to the collections and protecting them so that everybody can use them. So I just had a couple of quick tips for researchers here. Generally, you want to have like if you have the capacity to have a reading room, for researchers, that's great, because then you can sort of control the environment in which they're interacting with whatever collections that they're using. It's generally a good idea to transport items in archival trays and boxes so that you can, like we were talking about before with handling, keep it stable. You don't want to, like if they asked for several different collections at once, you want them to interact with them one at a time. It's generally not a good idea to leave researchers unattended, even if they seem like a great person. These items are, historically significant in some way, and so people may be tempted to make them disappear. It's not the nicest thing to think about somebody, but it's something to consider. You don't want them to, you want to keep them from having food, drink, and ink, pens, that can permanently mark items in the research area. Generally, people try to have researchers leave all their personal items at the door, or, like at the front desk. If you have a locker, they can lock their stuff in there. You just don't want them to have any of their personal items with them, again, for security reasons and so that no accidents happen. And also, just so that it's easier for all of you who maybe have limited staff or volunteers, make it by appointment. Walk-ins are great, but, it kind of puts a strain on, on employees when your staff is limited and you've got other things to do in the day. So if you make your researching by appointment, you can work that into your day better. So I found that's really helpful in terms of making sure you can successfully provide access. And this is just a real quick thing about balancing use and preservation. I've been talking a lot about, these items are significant for one reason or another, and how you need to make sure that you can, both allow people to use them, but also make sure they last for the long term, because, this item is great, but if it doesn't last the next 100 years, are you, is it serving its purpose? So, consider the stability of artifacts when you go to allow the public to interact with them. Is it possible to create a replica of this item so that people can still, use it, but you can preserve the original? Is there some intrinsic value to the original that would be destroyed if it was lost to time and space? And another thing to consider is how do you protect objects while still allowing visitors to interact? Sort of nebulous questions, and it's everybody can achieve them in different ways. So another thing to think about is, you've made your exhibits, you've done your tours, you've made your online, Instagram posts, is it effective? And one of the first things I learned about exhibits is that smiles are a legitimate measure of success. This man here is interacting with this train exhibit. He seems very engrossed. It's probably safe to say that this exhibit of this train is effective for him personally. It's also an option to do surveys. For those of you who attended Collections 101, I did ask you to do a survey. And it's because I want to know, was I effective? Did I achieve my goal? And you can do these surveys online, give somebody an access code. It's also a possibility to when they go to leave the museum or the historical society, you can say, hey, can you fill out this quick survey? I've also seen at larger institutions where they just have somebody observing the exhibit area and watching people interact. For me, that would be really uncomfortable. I don't like when people watch me when I'm interacting with exhibits and things. But it's an option. You can also do message boards and things like that. If you have a website, for example, or you have, a Facebook page, you can encourage people to leave comments about their experience. And another way to gauge effectiveness is just start inviting people to attend your board meetings, your planning sessions, and you can start to get a gauge on, are they enjoying what you're putting out? And going along with inviting people to board meetings, this is sort of stepping into the realm of collaboration. our duty is to serve the public. And if, the public isn't satisfied with what we're doing, we need to know that so that we can make changes, so that they feel more connected. It's important to consider what the makeup of your community is, like what, other groups do you have that you may not be seeing all the time as part of your general visitor makeup. What other institutions and organizations are in the area, who else is, sharing the pool with you, for lack of a better word. And do you notice any groups in your community that are lacking representation? This is something that has become very relevant recently. I think it's always relevant, but it's gaining more attention in recent months. And a great way, like if you already aren't, like I'm a very introverted person, so for me, like, getting to know people is a slower process, but it's important to go out into the community and make friends, essentially. You can't just go up to random people and be like, hey, come to our board meeting. That's going to be kind of off-putting, and I certainly wouldn't attend if something like that happened. But you want to like show that you're there in the community, because you are community members, aside from being, a pillar of an institution. And so you want to show yourself at community events as a community member and as a representative of your institution, and make sure you're just present and a friend. It can also be a good idea to offer resources and partnership without, strings attached. Yes, we want to work with you to provide more stuff at our institution, but we're going to work with you as well, and you don't have to give us anything in return at the moment. And that's always a good tactic to sort of build these friendships and relationships. And all of this, building these relationships, facilitating collaboration, is going to expand the ability to provide resources to the community and expand your message about, your institution and your history, and generally being a good person. Yeah, like one of the things that I've noticed working in the community is that, there are sometimes old beef and old blood, where, people perceive a harm done when there wasn't necessarily anything wrong, where it's like really, really deep seated, especially in like older communities, like really long-standing communities. You see these sort of, like for like a better term, like Hatfield and McCoy type, interactions happening. And like you could be the person that facilitates a healing of the breach between those two groups, and sort of bringing the community together. Because the more people you have working together, the easier it'll be to say, for example, like if you have two institutions, like two museums, for example, that are sort of like beefing over something that happened, 50 years ago, and all of three of you need money and materials to purchase boxes from Gaylord. You can, if you can facilitate sort of everybody working together, you can all split the cost of those Gaylord boxes. This is something I should have mentioned earlier, because the more people you have buying a large number of items on Gaylord in particular, like it makes the cost worth it. So there's another reason to collaborate and have friendships within the institutional community. So we're just about wrapping up. A few things to consider. Some of this carries over from Collections 101. Make sure you're fitting the needs of your institution whenever you go into deciding how you're going to preserve and share your collections. Make sure you're not stretching the limits of what you can do as a team. Consider your collections, consider your mission, because that'll help direct you in the direction you want to go. What does the community expect from you? If you have connections in the community, which I hope you would, because you are, like I said, you are members of your own community, use those connections, invite collaboration, and, take a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new and mix it together and see what happens. Because, some old standing ideas, they're there for a reason because they work. But what can you do to bring it into the present day? It's one of those things where it's like, very squishy and malleable, And, you know, like there are these guidelines, you know, we were talking about best practices on Tuesday. You know, we have best practices, and how do you make it work for you? So I guess that is the end of my presentation. We can take more questions now, either about, you know, using collections or about preservation, both. We can talk about both.
All right, so we have a suggestion that Matterport, M-A-T-T-E-R-P-O-R-T, so the word matter and the word port smushed together, is a great 3D program for virtual walkthroughs that has worked for Heather.
Oh, excellent.
So that is a helpful suggestion for folks who are trying to do, as everyone is, trying to get their collections and their exhibits online right now. Leslie Wagner has asked, can you talk about how to transport objects in a car?
Very carefully. Very carefully. So one of the things that I didn't talk about in terms of like dangers to the collection is vibrations. And I didn't talk about them because it's very sort of nebulous and I don't fully understand it yet. So like when you're like vibrating an object, that can cause like, you know, deteriorate, like it can cause it to become more fragile. It's a whole science thing. I don't quite understand it. But so I guess it would depend on how fragile it is, how small it is. Any sort of padding that you can use to like, you know, cushion it. If you're able to strap it down, that's a good idea. And also like how far are you going? Like if you're just going from like building A to building B and they're literally like a 30-second drive from each other, like you could probably just sit somebody in the back. You know, it's not, you know, not safe, you know, to go like a long distance like this, but you could sit somebody in the back with the object to make sure it doesn't like fall over or something like that. Betsy, do you have any thoughts on this? I haven't had to move collections that far.
True. I think having attempted to put furniture into my own car things that are in no way collections, just to be clear, I do know, and probably Leslie, you also know this as well, that you want to that probably your big danger points are getting it into the car, getting it out of the car, and getting it like in addition to the transportation, because it's, you know, there's small entry, you know, like the interior of your car might be this big, but the door is this big, so you want to make sure that it will actually fit through that door without dings along the way. And then there are, you know, the hazards while you're driving. There was at Ohio History Connection, sorry, this is more of an anecdote than anything helpful. The Ohio History Connection, we used to, we store most of our collections off-site, and we used to have speed bumps on the way into the parking lot at the main building.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah, the curators were not super pleased by that. Those have since been removed, so that's made their jobs easier. So our next question, now that we've done my pointless story.
I do want to say one thing real quick though. When it comes to moving collections long distances, transporting it in your car is going to be very different from like packaging for a very extended trip. So like say you're lending a collection to a museum across the country. Like that process is going to be very different. And that's like a whole other like webinar idea, is like how that packaging process happens. It's very complicated. I'm still learning about it.
It's very true. And this is less care and more just collections in general. It is my understanding that collections objects should never be unattended. So
oh no, don't leave it unattended.
Yeah. So if you're driving it a long enough distance that you need to like stop and go to the restroom along the way, you'll want to have at least two of you in the car so that one of you can stay with the object while the other goes in and buys some coffee, and you trade places, kind of thing. All right. And yeah, Leslie is also saying bubble wrap and non-skid blankets.
Bubble wrap, yes, but don't let it touch the object. Bubble wrap is one of those plastics that's very unpredictable. It's, as far as I know, it's safe for short term. However, you would not want to like wrap an object in bubble wrap and then leave it for 5 years, because those bubbles and that plastic will leave circles on your item and that won't go away.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to wrap it up and put it in your car and drive it, to the
Oh
next
yeah.
building over 20
Yeah.
feet away, you could probably, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
All right, so Trish is asking, any thoughts on sharing oral histories in the event that during some of the recording, conversation took place that wasn't meant for outside ears?
I mean, you will always want to have a master copy of your recording, and then you can put restrictions on that in terms of who is allowed to listen to it. And I know there's editing software, like I've never, done this with oral, like my experience with oral history is somewhat limited, but I know there's editing software where you can edit out part of a conversation and just remove it from the version that will be shared with the public.
I did work in an oral history archive when I was in graduate school, and the one thing that I would definitely say in terms of restricting oral history collections is you'll want to use an actual date, right? So no one is allowed to listen to this for 50 years after it was recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be tempted by the after I'm dead, or 20 years after the death of the interviewee, because the hard part is keeping track of when those people pass, which sounds terrible when I say it out loud, but is nevertheless true. So you're left with a thing that you don't know. You can release after so and so's death, but you have no way of knowing when so and so passes. It's all very, yeah. So if you're going to restrict it, do it. Like 50 years from recording, a date that you can track without outside information.
And
Learned
this is
that one the hard way.
also, oh, sorry, go
No, it's
ahead.
okay. No, they learned that one the hard way. Was the
Yeah. But this is also why when you're doing oral history, you want to come to an agreement, like both verbal and like a paper agreement beforehand with this person. And just like I'm very big on communicate, like whenever you're working with somebody else, be very open in your communication. And if they say, this is off the record and I don't want this part in, then, it's in your best interest to adhere to that.
and it looks like Ronald Marvin has recently discovered flammable nitrate film in their collections.
Ooh.
From an old World War II collection, and worked with the local fire department to dispose of it.
Good job. Good job. That's
There you
scary.
go. Yeah. I think we might be keeping nitrate film in a freezer at the Ohio History Connection, although I remember that largely based on a conversation after the derecho a few years ago, Derecho, however you say that, when the power went out for 2 or 3 days.
Oh no.
Yeah, apparently it's fine as long as the freezer is working. So
Yeah,
and
don't keep nitrate film if you don't have a good hardy freezer to keep it in.
yeah, so I think Ron's choice was probably the best choice in that situation.
Yes.
Because,
Yes.
okay, so Trish's asked, let's see, Trish's asking, we collect a lot of information on the history of homes and past owners of homes that are 100 plus years old. So the home's 100 plus years old. We are, quote, stuck in trying to decide what we share with general public. If information isn't shared via online, then what approval should be needed to allow a researcher access?
I mean,
Hang on.
is it
Clarification. When
okay?
personal or internal correspondence is shared and also photos with several people in the photo, is permission needed to share those pieces either online or with an individual researcher?
I guess it depends. I have heard of cases where people will say, I don't want this photo of me, out in the world. And again, it's best to adhere to those wishes and restrict it. I know that you can censor certain sensitive material. And so like the version you put online, is more acceptable to the public. I think in terms of like what you restrict, it's mostly like personal information. Like the most common thing I've heard about recently is like, it used to be a thing to put your social security number on your resume. So like stuff like social security number and like I guess current personal information you wouldn't want on there. I don't know, that's kind of a nebulous question. What do you think, Betsy?
I mean, I think in general, probably yes, you'd need permission, definitely to share, if you're going to put it online, it would be safest to have permission as as people are giving you the things, part of your deed, if indeed you do a deed of gift or just part of your correspondence, establish what they're comfortable having shared and when it can be shared. And I think your instinct that there's differences between putting something online versus sharing it with an interested, individual researcher is a good one. Because
Yes.
it's one thing putting it online so anyone can look it up versus we're going to put it into the archive. So, in 20 years from now, the people who buy your house can come in and look and see the history of the house. I think those are actually two different levels of access that people would have different levels of comfort with. So I think probably just be super clear in terms of when you're collecting it, what people are comfortable sharing. And Miranda chimes in to say we deal with a lot of redactions because we're a government and they're required to redact any personal identifiers and minor children's information, social security account numbers, policy numbers. That redacting can be as simple as blocking things out with a black marker before you send it out. I would
Just make sure you don't black out the original.
Don't black out the original. Make a photocopy and then black things out. And then it's although I would also caution you that sometimes you can read through black marker. So
if you can black it out digitally, that might be better.
Yeah, or what we would, and there are different state and federal requirements, as Miranda points out, which is true. A thing that so you can photocopy something. Take a blank piece of paper and put it over the part of the photocopy that you want to redact, and photocopy it again, which is a way that I have redacted things in the past. It's a little fiddly, and you end up with tiny pieces of paper in your recycling, but it works. And then you have to shred the original that had information that needed to be redacted, so that's a whole thing. But okay.
To go along with that, if you're working with a university, student information is often, there's specific rules about redacting student information. Just a FYI.
And Miranda was saying that that's how they're taught to do things, except they use Sharpie and whiteout. So
yeah, whiteout would be good too.
Make sure it's dry before you flip it back over on the photocopier, which I'm sure you know. Let's see, where were we? So flammable nitrate film. Heather Alexander suggests that the Air Force Museum in Dayton has a nitrates film section and can give advice, and they keep it stored in a liquid solution.
They're really great. They have a lot of wonderful resources, and the people there are very knowledgeable. I had several adjunct professors from there, and they were all great to work with.
So we have, we have a tip and then a fairly specific question. And Ron Marvin is saying, a tip I have for preserving collections is to select a small collection each season and apply for a specific dollar grant to purchase archival supplies.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
We also include shipping charges in the grant, then wait for a Gaylord sale, 25% off and free shipping to greatly increase the amount of material purchased for use later.
I like the way you think. I'm a fan of a good sale, yeah.
And Ron is pointing out that their film had already deteriorated and was off-gassing. And I think, yeah, indeed, Ron, your correct choice there was
yes, that was a good instinct. Yes.
It would have been great to be able to save it, but it doesn't sound like that was. All right, and then
Miranda, it also would have been great to see it, like to have it, react in a safe place and watch it burn or whatever it's going to do.
It would have been fascinating. That actually would have been.
Yeah.
Oh well. And I'm glad that the fire department had actually was willing to work with you on that one, because I know
Absolutely.
that sometimes they can be a little nonplussed when you discover active ordnance in your collections and you call them.
Yeah, that's why you got to make those connections in your community. Who do you know? Who can you become friends with, and who can you have assist you at a moment's notice?
yeah, they're more likely to take that call if they already know who you are. I suppose it's, yeah.
Yeah.
And then a question from Miranda was, does anyone know where to purchase a smaller quantity of polyethylene foam for packing and moving? So I'll throw that out to the chat box.
Yeah.
Because I
I
don't.
mean, my go-to is Amazon. You can find a lot of stuff on Amazon.
And I think that might be the last question that we have right now, but we can pause briefly and see if anyone has suggestions for Miranda, or if there's other questions that are coming up. So Trish is asking, do you have a resource to share that talks about copyright and collections?
So copyright still scares me because it's so incredibly complicated. I'm thinking of a Connecting to Collections Care webinar. Unfortunately, I don't have access to that at the moment, but if you go to a website called Connecting to Collections Care, they do have webinars there specifically about copyright. And I think one of the resources that I have on the resource list that I gave out at the first session, and I will give out again for the second session, has some sections in there on copyright. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's very complicated, and I'm often of the opinion of, if you know a lawyer who's familiar with copyright law, ask them questions.
I will say that the Digital Services Department at the Ohio History Connection, and it may have a different department name now, right now, deals with the copyright question a lot with the Ohio Memory website. So, and I believe, so emailing the general email, which let me check to make sure that it is what I think it is, would be, if for specific questions. Is it? We do not have Ohio Memory at ohiohistory.org. But if you check out Ohio Memory, there should be contact information there. And I know that staff does a lot with copyright questions, and that is a thing that they are informed on. And then Ron is mentioning that they have used duplicate items to create tactile tours for sight impaired visitors, which is actually a really great idea.
Yes.
And I know that some institutions have what they call education collections versus the museum's collections. So an education collection is a thing where you're tracking the materials you have, and they may indeed be, antiques but they're not necessarily unique enough or to be kept in the permanent collection, but that they are still useful for things like tours for the sight impaired, for interactives on the museum floor sort of thing. So that is always an option in terms of interacting with collections as well. And I think for some of our archival objects, there are replicas that exist that Ohio History Connection uses for that. And Miranda has mentioned that the ALA, which I think is the American Library Association, also has some good resources on copyright and general information.
Yes.
So yeah, copyright is one of those things where I know people who know about it, but I do not myself personally. And it's challenging with collections.
And it's challenging in general to research when you're looking to answer a specific question, because it's so, I don't know, it's one of those things that I find very nebulous.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I think this was indeed, as Ron says, a well, as many people said in the chats, it's a very informative session and a great either new learning or refresher session. So
I'm glad.
All right, thank you,
And it
everyone.
is nice to see people, you know, sharing their own experiences in the chat. So that's been really cool.
All right, everyone, wish you all a good afternoon, and we'll, I was going to say we'll see you in a couple of days, but no, in fact, we're not doing Collections 103 in a couple of days. So, but have a lovely afternoon.
Yes, thank you for attending.